Good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's Research Twilight. It's Research Twilight 4 because that's one that we'd cancelled just before Christmas. So confusion that it says 5 on your calendars, but it's 4 tonight. Tonight we're looking at types of knowledge, and it leads on nicely from the last Research Twilight that we had before. So we're looking at different types of knowledge: inflexible versus flexible knowledge, surface versus deep, and concrete versus abstract. The goal in this session is to try and understand some of those terms and to think about the role of inflexible knowledge on the journey towards expertise and mastery. Okay, so last session in Research Twilight 3, we looked at various things to do with memory, to do with moving students from a place of knowing something in a very sort of initial sort of exploratory way to actually being able to apply that knowledge. And we talked about kind of the difference that students have in their experience of the learning journey based on their prior knowledge. So there's lots of links with tonight's session, and one of those links is that Willingham's model of memory is crucial for understanding the sort of types of knowledge that we're going to cover. Willingham's paper is the paper that we're going to focus on later, that he wrote in 2002, and sort of subsequently he's built up this simple model of working memory and long-term memory, seeing the environmental factors that play into that for students. Okay, so a little anecdote to start us off with then. If I said to you that a teacher asked a student, what is the equator? And if that student replied quite confidently that they knew that the equator was a menagerie lion which runs around the earth. Well, this is a little sort of quip from Anguished English by Richard Lederer. And we can see in this example that the student has learnt something. They've learnt it wrongly, incorrectly heard that the equator is an imaginary line that runs around the earth, but actually possibly more vivid and more exciting what they've learnt as the definition of the equator there. What does this tell us? Well, obviously it's humorous, but it's a misunderstanding of his teacher's explanation of the equator. This is an example of rote or surface learning, accumulation of knowledge that we just kind of possess quite fleetingly, and in this case, inaccurately. This inaccurate, untethered knowledge cannot be applied to new contexts because it's neither correct nor is it linked to anything in a bigger schema. It's kind of obviously a little bit absurd that a child would even think that there is such thing as this menagerie lion that's running around the earth. So we're looking to move students to a place where they have knowledge which is not only accurate, but is really well tethered into a system of knowledge which we will call a schema, and that then they move into this place where they can actually have this flexibility with their knowledge to apply it judiciously as and when necessary. This is the paper that we're going to look at, so it's saved into the T drive. I'll put a link in when I email this out. The inflexible knowledge, the first step to expertise. So this is a paper from 2002 where Willingham tries to address this problem that teachers might have. So often, if I inventively present new material or emphasise the application of new knowledge in various situations, what I get back from my students seems to be rote. Why is this and what can I do about it? Well, in his paper, Willingham tries to address the fact that cognitive science shows us that when new material is learned, the mind is biased to remember things in really concrete terms. They are then difficult to apply to new situations. So I can see the benefits. I can understand why the human brain has developed this way, because I can understand wanting to have concrete, really finite things that you've learned immediately is going to be more readily applicable to perhaps the situation that you're immediately in. So there's a survival aspect to that, I would imagine. But we want, for our sophisticated thinkers, to be able to move to a point where they've got not just concrete knowledge, but abstract knowledge that they can also readily apply in new situations. So let's just kind of consider these terms. So rote learning and inflexible knowledge are very similar, but they're not identical. A student with rote knowledge might be able to produce a definition, but they might not necessarily understand it. So they've just learned it at a really kind of functional level. Inflexible knowledge isn't quite the same. It's possibly a bit more meaningful than rote learning, but it's still really narrow, and it's narrow in the fact that it's quite concrete. It's kind of linked to a surface. Sorry. Oh, bless him. That's John doing my hoovering, and I've just turned him away. Poor John. That it's connected to very little. It's just kind of on its own. It's quite narrow, and there's a deep structure that the concept is not connected to. There's something else that knowledge should be kind of working with, and it's not accessed when it's in an inflexible state of being. Willingham kind of defines it this way. he says that inflexible knowledge isn't useless. It's absolutely part of the learning process. It's the unavoidable foundation of expertise. We have to have something that we start with, that we understand the beginnings of, but then we need to move into a place where we're sort of applying that knowledge in a more systematic way. I can't help myself. I've been watching the Winter Olympics, so I've got to have an analogy. Of course, I do. I'm an English teacher, and you'll see that analogies and examples are important in our pedagogy. So that's good. We've got this curling, the curling stone. So rote learning, surface knowledge, inflexible knowledge. It's a good analogy to sort of think of it as just this block of something. We've got something that is quite finite, it's concrete, it's fixed, and it sort of just exists on its own. And if you think about this curling stone, it doesn't do anything on its own. In itself, it has lots of properties, but it's not sort of interacting with anything whilst it's just there on its own. So rote learning, surface, and inflexible knowledge deal with concrete examples. However, when we can move into the deeper, more abstract, flexible knowledge situation, what we have are sort of abstract ideas and crucially ideas which can be applied to new and creative applications. And this is the stuff of genius, isn't it? When we can start to have knowledge that we see and apply in new and innovative ways, that's where beauty lies, doesn't it? And I think of this as the curling stone now being moved along. And if you watch the skill of a curling, the brushing that they do, the sweeping, I should say, that they are able to actually direct that stone into a perfect position. And in the same way, we want our students to kind of know really judiciously, that's the moment when I can apply that formula, that term, that approach, that system of knowledge that I've got in place. That's when I can apply it. That's the direction that I'm going to send that knowledge in, so that I can really make it apply to something creative or new. So this is the sort of goal that we want as teachers. In a way, deep structure is the sort of principle that transcends the specific. So this deep structure of knowledge would be something that would underpin then other examples, possibly not even subject-specific examples, but just sort of core grounded understanding of this world, I guess, a schema that's kind of worldwide in some regards. So Willingham says we need to sort of fight inflexible knowledge by encouraging students to think about their material in a deeper, more abstract way. They can then generalise this to other contexts. That in itself, though, mustn't be at the cost of the inflexible knowledge in its own regard, because it's not useless, it's a process, it's towards something that is useful. Think about that in a bit more depth now. So, we've talked before about schema. So this schema is like a cognitive construct that permits us to classify multiple elements together into a single element that is useful and can be then applied to new ideas. We talked about that with when we looked at the Sweller paper. So within that, there's going to be borrowed information that we reorganise into the schema that we're constructing. And it's likely to be different in different informational contexts and different ways that new information is coming into that schema. Thinking about our topic tonight of flexible and inflexible knowledge, the idea that when students learn something, it's quite heavy and fixed in its own right. What we're probably doing when we move things into the schema is starting to make those connections that allow that knowledge to become more flexible and have that movement and that application. So something connected to our sort of long-term memory and building of schema there. Keep clicking the wrong thing. Come on, Rebecca. There we go. And we might expect that, and we've covered this before, that there's a high level of cognitive load when you're trying to deal with new information. So something, especially if you've got no prior knowledge, something that's coming to you brand new, there's quite a cognitive load that's heavy there, and that's something else to consider, is that when students are getting this knowledge, it's not going straight into a schema, it's not going straight into a long-term memory, and they're dealing with cognitive load. So we can't ever really repeat ourselves enough, I think, and have those sort of messages about the key knowledge that we want our students to absorb. We can't, and I know we all do it, we say, well, I've taught that. We mustn't assume that it's been learned. Okay, so that continuous kind of reinforcing and looking at things in a different way can help to reinforce that for students as well. I want to look at the implications for teachers just to finish this session off. And one of the implications for teachers, I've drawn most of this research twilight from Willingham's paper. There's just one of the implications for teachers that I've drawn from another source, and I'll give you the link for that paper as well. It's an article as well. So I referenced it earlier, Willingham is really, really clear that we must not ignore the crucial role that rote learning and inflexible knowledge have in the learning journey. It definitely has its place. He sort of words it that knowing more facts can make many cognitive functions, comprehension, problem solving, they can make those operate more efficiently. There definitely is value to knowing lots of stuff. If we minimise the learning of facts out of fear that they're perhaps going to be absorbed as rote knowledge, then we would truly be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So there's this idea of not being scared of facts and kind of knowledge organisers and giving students kind of this, set of things to learn. That in itself definitely has a place and has a value. It's just not the end of the journey. Next implication, as I said earlier, giving examples, using analogies, giving illustrative ways for students to understand the new knowledge. It helps them because they've got this concrete example. They perhaps need something that's more human for them, so something anecdotal would be helpful. Visual, we know about the benefits to things like dual coding. Meaningfully and memorably presenting facts. So there is a role for signalling and signposting to students with whatever kind of quirky and interesting approaches that you have. It has its place. But again, if you have a lesson that's kind of jazzy and quirky, that in itself is not enough to make that knowledge go into the long-term store or to be flexible. So it's a worthwhile part of the process, but it's only one part of the process. It's not the end. The implications here, this is the one that comes from the article. So this is the link there for improving teaching. Thinking about deeper learning and how do we move from this kind of, they call it episodic. So they sort of talk about their knowledge being just, one-off sort of bits of things they've picked up in lessons. How do we move that into more like a semantic memory, which I think is their sort of short code really for schema. So sort of more like a mapped memory of the same knowledge. And this article suggests you can never have enough different ways of looking at a type of knowledge. So different ways that the knowledge is asked through a question. They mention exit tickets, which we don't really talk about as much at Fulford, but there might be things that you're doing that are similar to an exit ticket, like a question that you're answering as you leave. Those hinge questions during the learning process, the bell tasks, maybe as part of those retrieval weekly quizzes. For particular examples that they give, they talk about things like perhaps a fact about history, having that fact from history actually being looked at from like the decade that it comes from, then maybe the sort of political sort of schema that it fits into, perhaps the personal history aspect. And you can see we're already doing a lot of this, but it's good practice to have that same core bit of knowledge kind of tied into several different approaches. Okay, I hope that's been useful, helpful. I hope that some of you will watch this. They are voluntary, these research twilights, but over the year we're going to then hopefully see what we might want to then take forward into some future CPD. If you've got any questions or thoughts, if you read those articles, I'm always interested. Just come and talk to me about anything that you think or how you see this applying in your own classrooms. Okay, thanks for listening, folks. How do I switch off? Oh no, I can't call for Andy on this. Right.